Okay, I propose that we begin. People who are still joining, they will move in the room in a second. Welcome everyone. Hello, welcome to today's session on global access to COVID-19 vaccines and the European Citizens Initiative Right2Cure. So my name is Jasper. I work as a policy officer at the Belgian NGO Viva Salud. And as part of the working group Determinants of International Health of Because Health Network, we set up this session together with the coordination committee of the European Citizens Initiative Right2Cure. Before we begin, I would like to say two technical points. So first of all, we will be recording today's session. I hope that's okay with everyone, but if you have an objection, just let us know in the chat box. Then secondly, we have made sure of translation from English to French. So on the bottom of your screen, you will find this globe where you can choose to follow the session in French if you would like to. Now, in general, I don't think that there can be any better moment to have today's session and to talk about access to COVID-19 vaccines. Just yesterday, the executive board of the World Health Organization was opened with a speech by Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the World Health Organization. He was very blunt, and he actually said that the world is on the brink of a catastrophic moral failure. So although the immunization campaigns have started in a number of countries around the world, and around 40 million doses have been administered already, apparently, only 25 doses have been administered in a low-income country. According to the People's Vaccines Alliance, 9 out of 10 people are set to miss out on a vaccine in 2021 at least. At the same time, we have seen that Pfizer and Moderna will be making $32 billion of profits in COVID-19 sales. So it's clear that the promise of equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines, well, is at serious risk, basically. Also today, a plenary session is being held or was being held in the European Parliament to talk about the different vaccination strategies. I'm sure that we will come back on this topic later in the session. And also today, an informal meeting of the TRIPS Council is being held at the World Trade Organization to talk about the TRIPS Waiver Proposal, also something that we will be discussing today. So what will we be doing, and how is today's session organized? So we invited a number of speakers, of experts, to give organizations and civil society actors that support the European Citizens Initiative or plan to support the European Citizens Initiative, to give them the opportunity to ask questions and basically to discuss with international experts about this issue, about this question of access to COVID-19 vaccines. We already received a number of questions during the registrations. Basically, the speakers have prepared their presentations on the basis of these questions. But I want to mention that at the end of this session, we will have half an hour to discuss even more, and you will be able to ask your questions either in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen or by raising your hand. When you raise your hand, you will be upgraded to panelist, and you will be able to ask your questions out loud to the speakers. So for today's program, we have invited 3 experts, 4, I should say, because of course, first of all, we will hear from Julie Steendam, who is the coordinator of the European Citizens Initiative. She will be talking about the European Citizens Initiative, give us an update at where we are. Then secondly, we have invited Prasanna Saligram. He is a policy analyst and expert in health systems and in public health policy from India. He has been a communications officer of the Global People's Health Movement and is currently associated with the Equitable Access to COVID-19 Technologies project of People's Health Movement. Then Priyam Cherian will join him. She is a Delhi-based lawyer working on public health with a focus on access to medicines and currently working as a research associate with the PHM Act project. She has worked on addressing intellectual property barriers to essential health technologies and has engaged closely with the patient community in demanding an environment for equitable access to health tools and treatment in India. Both of them will be focusing on the international level. They will be talking about the different kinds of international proposals that are currently being set up to realize equitable access. And then our fourth expert speaker is Dimitri Einikel. He keeps a close watch on the latest developments in the positions of the European Commission as a EU policy and advocacy advisor for the MSF Access campaign and MSF Belgium. He formerly supported and managed healthcare projects in a crisis context. So welcome to all of you. Welcome to our speakers, to the participants. I wish you a very interesting afternoon. So Julie, I think I will pass on to you, give the floor to you. So welcome.
Yeah, many thanks, Jasper and all the other organizers of the sessions. Also, thanks to Prasanna, Priyam, and Dimitri to be here. So I'm Julie Steendam. I'm the European coordinator of the Citizens Initiative Right2Cure. I'll give a short intro on what the initiative is about and what we are hoping to achieve with this. I'll keep it short because we mainly want to give the floor to the experts. So let me try to share my screen. Okay, we have an inception now, but now you can see my presentation if everything went well. Okay. So the European Citizens Initiative, I'm screen sharing now our website, which is no-profit-on-pandemic.eu. And the European Citizens Initiative is an official tool that is put in place by the European Commission as a tool for direct democracy. It gives citizens and civil society organizations the opportunity to introduce legislative proposals directly to the European Commission. So it kind of puts us at the same level as European elected members of the parliament. Of course, we can't just do that. There's one condition, it's not a small one. We need to collect 1 million signatures of European citizens to be able to do so. So this is our ambition. We want to collect 1 million signatures of European citizens to make sure that the European Commission does everything it can to make anti-COVID-19 vaccines and treatments universally available. This is mainly focusing on the problems that we see currently with intellectual property rights, which are limiting the access to COVID-19 vaccines globally, but also in our own countries inside of Europe. But we are also making the demand that the negotiations going on between the Commission, our governments, and pharmaceutical companies should be fully transparent. I think the other speakers will also talk about this, but until now, we do not, as citizens or even elected representatives, do not have a clear view on how much public money was contributed, how much we are paying, and also clinical scientific data on the exact effectiveness of the vaccines is not available to us. So these are the key demands. Make sure that intellectual property rights do not harm the access, and make sure that all the negotiations are happening transparent. So basically, we're making a call for public control on these needed vaccines. To do so, we need to collect the 1 million signatures, as I said. This is a bit a screenshot of the online signature forms and also gives an idea of where we are right now. We started this initiative on the 13th of November. This is the first day that we started collecting signatures, and we're quite happy where we are so far. After 1 month and a half of warming up, basically, we already have 31,000 signatures. A bit more. We are really having a boost today, so that's great to see. And we also already have signatures from all European member states, which is very motivating. Of course, I'm not doing that by myself. I unfortunately don't have 30,000 friends, but we are a coalition of already over 120 civil society organizations all over Europe. And I guess most of the participants in this room are staff members or volunteers of organizations that are already part of the coalition. We are mostly NGOs, trade unions, medical students, health groups, health activists, health mutualities, and some youth organizations as well. So we are quite a diverse coalition of people advocating for this access to COVID-19 vaccines globally, which is very motivating. Together as a coalition, we set up strategies and common action days to gain more visibility and to collect. So if your organization is part of the coalition or wishes to join, I would very much motivate them because we have a very motivating dynamic of deciding on common action days, European-wide videos, images, visuals, open letters that we are developing to make sure that we have the maximum visibility and the maximum impact. Our key demands, and you can also see them on the screen, are focusing on the European Commission. With this initiative, we can only have a change on what the European Commission can do or what is within their capacities. And this is not a small thing, but it's also a strategy. Of course, there's a lot of problematics around the current research and development model based on making private profit and exclusive rights on the side of pharmaceutical companies, but it's also our strategy or aim to put the European Commission or to show its responsibility in this debate. But I'm sure that this will also be presented later on during the presentations of the speakers. So basically, our campaign is to show the public support for these demands and also to show the call made by citizens that they also have, of course, an interest in having access to these vaccines and not overpaying for this. Signatures can be collected online. I'll make sure to add a website link in the chat later on, but these can also be collected by paper forms, as has been done in a safe way. I think this weekend we can see some pictures from volunteers collecting signatures kits, and also by the people of Médecins pour le Peuple, Geneeskunde voor het Volk, in Belgium when they were visiting some patients. So you can do both. You can do online signatures and paper signatures. We also have a very nice day of action coming up this week on the International Hugging Day. This is a bit an example of what we want to do with that. We will make the call for people to share an old picture of a person that they would like to hug again and make the link with we need free access to the vaccines so we can also have free access to hugs, basically. So this will be a social media challenge that is also coming up. This is a campaign that is meant to be motivating, creative, and is also especially meant to win. We are sure that this support of 1 million European citizens exists. The only challenge is that we need to find them. So I'm very happy to have you all aboard during this meeting and that we can share this interest and goal of making sure the European Commission responds to the promise that it has made. I will leave it to here and give the floor to the speakers, and because at the end you can ask any question you would like also concerning the specificities of this European Citizens Initiative.
Thank you, Julie, for giving us an update on where we are with the European Citizens Initiative. I will give the floor now to Prasanna and Priyam from People's Health Movement, who will, as I mentioned before, give us an update on what initiatives exist at the international level to ensure equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. So welcome Prasanna, welcome Priyam, up to you.
Thanks, Jasper. I'll
Thanks.
just try to share. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Priyam.
Yeah, I'll just try to share my screen.
Yeah. Good
Is
morning,
this
everyone.
visible?
Julie, that was very inspiring to hear that you're already at 30,000. So after today, it should reach nearly 60. So we'll see how it goes. Yeah, Priyam, you can go ahead and I will chip in as and when it's needed.
Okay. All right. Sorry. There's some problem with my it's stuck.
You want me to share?
Yeah, I think this my laptop is hanging. I can try sharing again. Oh, sorry. Prasanna, I think you'll have to share. It's hanging every time I try to. Sorry.
Yeah. Are you able to see?
Yes.
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So we are going to talk about the basics of what TRIPS is, what TRIPS flexibilities are, what are we talking about when we ask that TRIPS provisions should not be applied in context of COVID, and the mechanisms that have been set up after COVID came in, which are the COVAX and CTAP mechanisms. We'll try and engage directly to answer some of the questions that were shared with us. Prasanna, next slide, please. So the
Sorry,
first
Priyam,
question
is it
was,
possible?
yeah,
Is it
yeah.
possible to use your camera? It will
Oh,
be a bit
okay.
more nice to see you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So the first question, Prasanna, next slide. Sorry, we went back to the first slide. Thank you. So the first question is whether intellectual property poses no barrier to equitable access to COVID-19 medicine, vaccines and technologies, because that's what the developed countries and the innovator companies have been saying, that intellectual property is important for R&D. And is that so? We say it is not so, because intellectual property is not what has been pushing innovation. And particularly, we have seen that in context of COVID, that it's when there was a huge public health emergency, where there was a demand, that's when the whole system started looking at how to develop drugs, therapeutics, diagnostics around intellectual property, around COVID-19. And what uh, intellectual property does is that it creates barriers. It disallows third parties from making the same product at competitive prices. So, for instance, if you have patents over medicines, you can't have another company making the same medicine. If there are more companies making the same medicine, you would have gotten it at much cheaper prices, or you would have gotten it in countries where it's not being manufactured by the innovator company. Similarly, there are barriers created because of copyright. There are several research and development papers that are behind paywalls and would not be available to people because they have to pay high prices to access these texts. And that in turn obstructs research and development. And another aspect of intellectual property that we could also look at is industrial design. So, for instance, there could be walls that could be attached to the oxygen ventilators that could be created, but if they're protected by intellectual property such as industrial design, again, it restricts using those devices by supplying it through generic means. Next slide, please. So when we talk about whether IP is a
Sorry.
barrier or not, no, this is fine. There are several examples. So first one is there was severe shortages of remdesivir, and we know that remdesivir was one of the drugs, repurposed drugs that was being looked at to treat COVID-19. And when there were shortages, there were also questions of whether Gilead, which holds the patent for remdesivir, would supply it to other countries, which they did in turn enter into voluntary licenses. But the problem is these voluntary licenses have also been exclusive in nature, in the sense that while the voluntary licenses allowed certain companies to make those make remdesivir and supply it to countries, at the same time voluntary license excluded several countries from being included in the license, which meant that even though different companies could manufacture remdesivir, allowing slight reduction in prices, they were disallowed from selling that drug in a lot of countries. Prasanna, next.
Yeah, in fact, the whole of Latin America was left out of this licensing provision. So they could not have access to generic medicine.
Yeah. Can you press next? Yeah. Similarly, there have been barriers on intellectual property, included lawsuits where the companies holding the know-how to produce a particular vaccine refuse to share it with other companies. And this is what different types of intellectual property creates barriers in access to COVID-19 technologies. Next, please. So this is another example of the barriers. So we know that there were several drugs that were repurposed for COVID-19 in the beginning of the pandemic, including 8527, tocilizumab, baricitinib. And if you see at the extreme right, these are all drugs which have patents which run till 2036, 2029, 2028, which meant that there was no other player who could potentially make these drugs and ensure that they are available at competitive prices or are available in more quantities, which means that the companies that own the intellectual property over these medicines can control how the market would work around these. Next, please. Now, the next question is whether intellectual property enabled development of COVID technologies, which the answer to which is definitely no, because the COVID pandemic itself is what propelled the companies to start looking at how to develop responses to these. And even since the beginning of the pandemic, we saw it was the governments who were earmarking huge amounts of money for developing the technologies around COVID. And what is interesting is that the government was not simply giving money to government institutions, it was also funding private institutions to accelerate the research that they were doing in this field. So even before COVID, if you would have seen, there were massive public spending to the extent of 70% to have R&D in different fields of diseases.
Yeah, for example, Moderna vaccine was a publicly funded technology. And then Moderna tried to have an intellectual property for the vaccine. All of you, I hope, know that there are two vaccines that are being used in UK and US. One is by Pfizer, the other is by Moderna. Moderna was actually supported through National Institute of Science grant. And yeah, Moderna tried to have a patent and it was publicly shamed. And then that's when it said that it is not going to have the intellectual property. So just an example as to show that public spending has been the driver of innovation. Yeah, this is a good example.
So this is an example of EU, the extent of money that they have spent in funding different projects on developing therapeutics, diagnostics related to COVID-19. And you see that there are over 10 projects and over billions of euros that have been spent to fund these, which means that, and this has gone to several private projects as well. If you look at CureVac, which is number 5, I think, is also a publicly funded project. That is, if these projects are publicly funded, then is there a reason why the private entities should be allowed to exercise at least 20-year monopoly over these, over the results that they get from these? Next, please. So what do we have next? Now that we see that there are several IP barriers, countries are constantly grappling with what to do. There are countries who have great capacity to produce generic versions of existing repurposed drugs. There are countries who have capacity to produce certain portions or certain parts of the vaccines. And there are countries that are utilizing existing technologies like 3D printing, but they're not able to do so because they're under constant threat of being facing sanctions for using those IP protected products. So for instance, there were several reports of threat of copyright infringement issued against those who tried to create 3D printed versions of walls that were used for respirators. And similarly, because these examples were coming up, some countries decided that they need to amend their laws which protect intellectual property. So Canada, Germany, and Hungary amended their laws that allowed faster issuance of compulsory license. So a compulsory license is a special provision that's provided under the patents law that allows suspension of rights of a patentee for some time in case they do not follow certain requirements of, say, making the patented product available in sufficient quantities, make overpricing it. So what the pandemic did was developed countries like Canada and Germany said, hey, there's a problem with IP. We should ensure that there is people do not get discriminated against and don't have access to these technologies because intellectual property is posing those barriers. So we should make our lives easier by allowing suspension of these rights. And these rights are suspended at local levels. So compulsory licenses work only at country levels and not at international levels. But the question is what happens when one country has the capacity to make it, but the other country does not. And under those circumstances, there are provisions that allows the country to import that patented product from other countries. Next slide, please. So now the question arises, why is TRIPS important? We see that there are national legislations and IP is protected nationally. That is, if I have a patent in the EU and I do not have a patent in India, that's possible. But that's also possible that I have a patent in EU as well as a patent in India. So what TRIPS did was, TRIPS is an agreement called the Trade Related Aspects on Intellectual Property Rights that came into picture with the establishment of the World Trade Organization. And so this is applicable to all the member countries of WTO. What TRIPS did was it created a minimum standard requirement. And the idea was that intellectual property will propel free trade and will allow free flow of technology and exchange of trade across the countries. But what it did was create barriers. So the trade related aspect of intellectual property rights deals with different types of intellectual properties, including patents, copyrights, industrial designs, trademarks, geographical indications, and integrated circuits. And it imposes an obligation on all member countries to provide certain minimum protection to all of these. So for instance,
what are called as homogenization. So each country had their own ways of protecting their own whatever, encouraging or protecting public health. Now what WTO and TRIPS did is homogenization, that everyone has to adhere to these minimum standards. Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine.
Continue.
Yeah. Can we go to the next slide?
Yeah, and the contradiction that a monopoly, which is IPR, is a monopoly, but WTO was meant to encourage free trade. So how can a monopoly provision be there as part of a free trade organization? That is the contradiction there.
So when we talked about TRIPS, and this is something that you would have heard, especially after the COVID set in, that there is something called TRIPS flexibilities, and we should be exercising it, and there should be licensing. So what is this all about? So now that we've seen that TRIPS has minimum standards to be followed, at the same time, it also says that the member countries can have special provisions. They can make special provisions in their domestic laws so that their public health is safeguarded. And this has time and again been also affirmed in several declarations. And the pioneering one in that was called the Doha Declaration.
Oh.
I have the impression that Priyam lost connection.
Yeah, I think so. Priyam Priyam froze. Anyway, I'll just continue. So the
Okay.
Doha Declaration affirmed that public health has to be promoted and you should take accordingly some measures. And that's how compulsory license was considered a magic bullet. So the compulsory license comes in when voluntary licensing do not happen. So in voluntary licensing, it is an agreement between two companies. And if the companies don't come to an agreement, if the companies don't establish a quick way of manufacturing the generic versions, then the country can come in and then say, no, 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 hey, you people are endlessly fighting. So I will bring in compulsory licensing so that I will decide what is the royalty, I will decide what is the duration and those sorts of things. So compulsory license was meant to be that way to also enable access. Another one was it allowed African countries which did not have manufacturing capabilities to also import by issuing a compulsory license. An African country, for example, can issue a compulsory license and an Indian manufacturer can then supply the generic product to that country. This is called as the TRIPS flexibilities.
Sorry.
Yeah, so, but what
I
is the
had
problem?
got disconnected.
Sure,
Go
continue.
on. Go on, Prasanna.
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah, no,
come
that's
from where you were. Go on.
no, that's okay. Continue. I just went to the next slide. Yeah.
Okay, so basically when we've spoken about how TRIPS flexibilities allows countries to make special provisions. Now, what is voluntary licensing? Voluntary licensing is something that the IP holder is given the power to, and they decide who should be given this license, whether this license should be exclusive or non-exclusive, what should be the terms of licenses. So for instance, when we were speaking about the voluntary license on remdesivir by Gilead had the power to exclude so many countries from having access to remdesivir, and that is the problem with voluntary license. Even in context of COVID-19, when we talk about voluntary contribution by the innovator companies, we are giving in power to them to decide what would be the terms and conditions. Similarly, if we also have statements by International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations who have said that they do not want to contribute to the voluntary sharing mechanisms of COVAX. And that is where the question comes. Will the voluntary license or the voluntary contributions work in the pandemic? And the response is that we're not seeing that it's working. And we need an active obligation on all entities to contribute to the greater pool for active sharing. Next slide, please. And that's where the waiver proposal comes in. Now, India and South Africa made a proposal to the TRIPS Council that there should be a waiver of implementation, application, and enforcement of certain provisions of the TRIPS. And these provisions relate to providing protection over copyright, industrial design, patents, and protection of undisclosed information. And this waiver proposal seeks that there be suspension over these rights for a certain period of time. And this period is till vaccination of a comprehensive population has been achieved, so that there is a balance and availability of health to everybody across the globe, and not just in countries that can afford to buy health and technologies related to COVID. And what will this waiver do? By suspension of rights over patents, copyrights, and undisclosed information, what happens is you allow other parties and entities to make these products, make them available in larger quantities, and make them available at more competitive prices. And this will also allow the countries to share their knowledge and export or import wherever possible. Prasanna, you wanted to add?
No, I think that's fine. I think, yeah, the idea is also that this will give the whole entire supply chain or the value chain as we call it. So people will have access to the whole supply chain, right? From the molecular level to the final drug development. There are no barriers. That was the intent. Sorry, continue.
Next slide, please. So now,
yeah,
one of the questions that's raised by developed countries is we don't want to impose waiver on these IP in our country. But the point is that if the waiver proposal goes through, it's not necessary for these countries to suspend the enforcement of these rights. What the waiver proposal does is that it gives the freedom to the countries to choose not to provide enforcement to these rights. The countries that are actually obstructing the waiver proposal are taking away the rights of the other countries to protect public health of their own population. So while the waiver proposal is applicable to all the members, it also allows these members to decide to what extent they would want to suspend or allow enforcing these rights related to the COVID-19 products. And it's very important to know that it's only applicable to the COVID-19 products. So it's not like you are completely destroying the manufacture, R&D, and the profit-making system for the pharmaceutical companies. Next slide, please.
And another point is that pharma companies do recover their costs mostly from developed countries. And they have, developing countries are a very small market. So in that sense, developed countries can choose to still not invoke the waiver, but allow the developing countries to do so. So that is the idea.
I just wanna mention that you have 5 more minutes.
Oh, okay, we have to really rush through the story. Thanks. So the next aspect we come to is COVAX, and it's one of the pillars that was developed after the COVID-19 set in, and it's part of the Access to COVID-19 Accelerator, which was partly, now I can say partly developed by the EU. So COVAX focuses on vaccines, and it was launched in April 2020 and brings together different collaborators, including governments, health organizations, private sector, public sector, and it's one of the basic funders is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the idea was that COVAX would be a kind of platform where they would provide 2 billion doses by the end of 2021 to certain countries that they have identified at prices that are yet to be seen. But it was to provide them at more accessible prices. Next slide, please. But the problem with COVAX is that even though they're saying that they'll provide these many doses, it would not be sufficient to cover the population that they target. It will hardly be 20% of the population that they intend to target. And it also has agreements with some companies that will provide the vaccine doses to them, but they have only reached up to about 400 million doses, which still does not completely fill up the quota that they are trying to come up with. And another issue is that there are constant delays in trials related to these vaccines. So we never know at what stage will COVAX get its own supply of vaccines. And it highly relies on the contribution of other member countries like Britain and EU. So to how long will COVAX function, how much money will it have will also depend on how much the countries will be willing to contribute to it. And because of these inefficiencies, it will also have to pay a higher price, because if there's intellectual property, it will have to negotiate at a level where the patentee can claim how so much ever money they want to claim. Next slide, please. So in terms of COVAX, there have been 44 bilateral deals to at least 12 deals this year. And right now, the question is whether the countries who are stocking up on their own, trying to get into nationalistic approach to health, who are having bilateral agreements with the pharmaceutical companies, buying excess doses, will they be going back and donating the excess doses to COVAX? Will that be sufficient to respond to the needs of the developing countries? And the problem is that while WHO created these vertical, it's on the margins. It is unable to do anything other than literally ask vaccine producers to provide full data or provide extra doses to voluntary mechanisms. Like yesterday, the Director General in his statement before the EB Executive Board made several requests, and those were requests. They could not direct the countries or the companies to do what is required to respond to this pandemic, and that's a problem that we'll have to find a solution to. And the last point being that even for regulatory approvals, that the companies prefer to apply to countries that will give them better profits instead of making an application to the WHO and having a better access to data for other countries as well. Next slide, please. So the other vertical that we're talking about is the CTAP, which is the pooling of technology and know-how. And question is whether it's important to pool knowledge and technology. And we think it's very important, and especially in this time of COVID, where there are several IP barriers. We have seen several examples where the potential to have better access, better affordability to health is being obstructed. And what will this do? Pooling of knowledge and technology will help more local production, will help the smaller countries to use whatever technologies, funds they have to make better things, maybe at cheaper prices, and make available to their population whatever they can. And this will help also ramping up the production and organic research. Organic research, because they already have access to this knowledge, and they will also be prompted to develop further on what is already available. Prasanna, you want to add something to this?
No, we'll come to that when we talk about what has happened to the innovation.
Right. So when we talk about why should companies share their inventions when they did all the work, like Prasanna also pointed out earlier, that most of the research actually happens in the universities that's public funded. So what does pharma do? They come, they take over, they buy that knowledge, and they multiply it because they have the manufacturing capacity, and say that they have the patent over it and restrict everybody else from making the same thing. Whereas it was first found based on the taxpayers' money. And what we've also seen is that most of the research that is IP protected is not really something that has built substantially new things. They are built on already existed things. And the question is whether you can protect them by imposing intellectual property barriers, which we do not think we should be.
Okay.
Yeah, there is this famous graph. Yeah, I'll just take one more
Yeah,
minute.
we're out of, yeah.
Yeah, I know. One more minute, sorry, Yasmin. There is this famous graph. Ever since TRIPS has come in, how the new chemical entities have gone down. If you can see that TRIPS came into being in 1994, and by 10 years, by 10 years, less than 10% of the drugs approved had some real therapeutic effect. So research and development and innovation through patenting, through IPR is not exactly the way forward, because once you do, it's an incremental research. If you close the doors with patenting, and then you will land in trouble because no further development can happen.
Okay,
So like I
thank you.
said earlier, yeah, I think it covers most of it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Sorry, Asper, for
Perfect.
exceeding
Yeah, we
time.
can answer any other questions when it comes.
Yeah, I'm sure that we will come back with questions after the other presentations. Thank you, Prasanna. Thank you, Priyam, for this comprehensive overview of how intellectual property poses a barrier to equitable access, and of course, what pathways exist for countries to overcome these barriers. So let us move on to Dimitri Einikel from MSF. He will talk about the European Commission's position, what the discussions are at the European level. So welcome, Dimitri. I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And thank you to you, Jasper and Julie, for organizing, and to the Friends of the People Health Movement for their very comprehensive presentation. It was very informative. I think you can share my screen, right? I should be able to do that, I guess. So let me quickly see if I can go full screen on this one. You see my slides?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
See if I can show this properly, that it's a bit more clear. Here you go. You see this?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay. So yeah, about the European perspective, I'll run over a couple of things, and then afterwards we can take it to questions. So feel free at that time to ask for more details if you want. I'll just go over the main issues. So Once the pandemic hit Europe, and particularly Italy, and then afterwards the other EU member states, the European Commission and the European Union came together quite quickly to announce a global response, highly mediatized, basically saying, look, we're all in this together in the EU, but also on the global level, and we will collaborate. You know, everybody needs to get access to the medical tools they need. Vaccines will be developed, and they need to be accessible and affordable for everybody. And with the quote that has often been used, nobody is safe until everybody is safe. The European Union has done this through a Team Europe approach, as they call it, which is basically the European Commission and the member states working together rather than one of them leading alone or in their respective competencies, but a more collaborative approach where the different entities speak to each other very often, take initiatives together, and then execute them, so to say. There was, as I said, a highly mediatized global pledging conference where it was notable that that Merkel, von der Leyen, Macron, so the leaders of some of the main leaders of the EU or of EU member states, were referring to vaccine as a global public good. This was also translated in a World Health Assembly COVID-19 resolution that was adopted, I think, in May last year or around June. I don't remember exactly. But there, where it was this, sorry.
It was May.
Yeah, May, right. So where it was interestingly described as vaccination as a global public good. So you already saw a little bit of a nuance there between the product and the rollout of the vaccines, so to say, that will be global public goods, which legally, of course, could potentially mean something differently and actually does not mean anything at all anymore. So just to say that there was at some point a narrative used by EU leaders that clearly pointed to making vaccines and global, some of these tools accessible for everybody and affordable. Perhaps there was even an ambition in that regard, but quite quickly we saw after that started to erode back to more the common practices that we have witnessed in the healthcare sector for many decades, and the problems related to that with regards to access and affordability and availability of medical products. The EU took some leadership in the creation of the X Accelerator, as was briefly introduced before, which is basically a collaboration between the World Health Organization, the EU, the World Bank, the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, etc. So they took some political lead in setting that up, where the COVAX, as was explained, is the vaccine arm of the ACT Accelerator. So it's the pillar that actually works on vaccines. There are also pillars working on therapeutics, on diagnostics, on healthcare systems, etc. But the COVAX is the vaccine arm. The EU also organized a global pledging conference, or actually two, one in May and one in June. It raised about 16 billion euro. 11 billion or 12 billion of those were pledged by EU member states and the Commission and the European Investment Bank together. So quite a lot of that number actually. And then it becomes a little bit more murky to know where those that money went. Not that it's all secret or that we cannot know, but it's just very confusing because sometimes it's money that comes from a member state, the Commission refers to, and the other way around. So you don't never really know. I mean, it's hard to figure out where the money exactly comes from and goes to. So I will not provide a whole overview of where all the money went. It's also not super interesting. I think it would be good if somebody did some proper research on that. I have not done it, to be honest. I didn't find the time to do it, and it's not the main topic of discussion. But just here, some figures. The EU has invested of those 16 billion, about 1.4 billion that was pledged will go to research and development, and in particularly to EU companies and research institutes to do research on COVID-19 response, let's say, of which by September already 500 million was invested. So 1/3 of it was already invested into specific projects. You can see the breakdown that was from September last year. So it's a little bit outdated, but I didn't find a new version of this graph. The link is in the slide to go to the document itself. So you can see clinical management and treatment, vaccines are important, and preparedness and crisis management are some of the important how do you say that, portfolios where some of that research money went. Of the global response, quite a bit of money also went to social and economic consequences, which is nothing wrong within itself, but just important to know that it didn't all go to vaccine development or treatment development. That's a bit what I'm saying here. And particularly, as I said, with the research and development, that a lot of it went to European research products. Because when it comes to the global efforts, about 100 million euro, that's supposed to be euro, went to CEPI. So it's not huge. I mean, it's a good amount, but it's not huge compared to what was invested in European research institutes. And then I think this is an important one. It is an important contribution that the EU has made. The European Commission contributed 500 million or half a billion euro to COVAX for the purchase of vaccines. If you add the amount that the European member states pledged, you come to a figure of 850 million euro. I mean, that's a general support. We have to be honest about it. It's good that the EU has been good in supporting this. But then it becomes interesting what happened, because on the one hand, the EU supported the creation of the ACT Accelerator and COVAX, but at the same time, the US started to engage in negotiations with pharmaceutical companies and pledge a lot of money to these companies to purchase them and do research and development for COVID-19 vaccines, and started to negotiate purchasing agreements. And this is where the EU basically made a side jump, and on the one hand supported the creation of a global system for access to the vaccines, where that system was supposed, which is COVAX, which was supposed to buy these vaccines for all countries, including EU countries, at least conceptually. But the EU sidelined it itself and started to negotiate bilaterally with the pharmaceutical companies and purchase or reserve doses from those companies itself, thereby theoretically undermining, or in practice actually undermining, the COVAX system they were trying to set up. 9 member states at some point expressed an interest to say, look, we're actually interested to buy our vaccines through COVAX, because there was a request from COVAX to go around with each state or each government and ask around, hey, are you interested to buy our vaccines through us? And so 9 expressed their interest, but then the EU basically forced its own member states to say, look, either you're going to buy through us, everything through us, or everything to COVAX, but you can't have both. So you need to choose which system you will follow. And all of them in the end used the European Union bilateral deals and purchased their vaccines under these conditions that were negotiated by the European Commission. So as a writer, EU purchase, the EU has now negotiated the purchase of 2.3 billion doses from 6 pharmaceutical companies with a total value of 3.2 billion euro. And they're still negotiating with 2 more companies. Novavax is one of them, the other one I don't remember by heart. In those contracts, there is a possibility that they can resell or donate the vaccines that they have purchased, but it's on a voluntary basis. So basically, the way it also has been set up, to understand a bit, is the European Commission negotiates with the pharmaceutical companies, negotiates the price, the conditions, the terms of the agreement, etc. And then EU member states say if they agree to this kind of draft agreement. And then if they do agree, then the EU member states have a contract directly with the pharmaceutical company. So the European Commission does not own vaccines itself. It's the member states that own the vaccines, and so they can decide what they do with it. Do they use them, or do they actually sell them? And also, just to point out, there's a difference between reserving the doses and buying the doses. So most of the agreements are reserving the reservation of some of the doses that are still being produced right now, and when the doses are being delivered, that's when the purchase actually happens. It's a technical matter, but it's just important to understand that there's a slight nuance. Then when it comes to the global response, or to continue in the global response, what's the EU's position? Well, on CTAP, which is the voluntary licensing pool, or the licensing pool for intellectual property rights and technologies that was explained before, the EU did not openly support CTAP, but a couple of, or at least did not express support for CTAP as such. But a few member states did. So the Netherlands and Portugal expressed support, Belgium expressed support, Luxembourg and Norway. There may be a possibility that Italy and France will support it. It's not sure, but there is a possibility. Let's say they're a bit more open to the proposal. Sorry, and then there's an intellectual property rights action plan that the EU has developed just before, in the second half of last year, and put online, where it is described as the sharing of critical IP in the times of crisis, that they want to facilitate and promote, such as during a pandemic. It's even noted in a document, but it's not sure what a mechanism the European Commission has in mind. They don't refer to CTAP specifically. There is a EU COVID-19 manifesto, which describes a number of steps that they ask beneficiaries of their funding to sign on to, research entities, I mean, and that has to do with voluntary licensing to share their data, open publications of scientific papers, etc., as well as the knowledge and the data to be shared on open platforms, so that other people actually, what it boils down to, that others would be able to use the technology and then use those intellectual property, what's in the intellectual property rights, and produce themselves. There are about 2,000 signatories to the manifesto, but no major pharmaceutical company developed that is developing, for example, a vaccine or a major treatment in the pipeline has signed on to the manifesto. The European Commission does refer on its EU COVID-19 manifesto webpage to CTAP as saying, hey, this is how we link to CTAP. Even if they didn't endorse it, they kind of link it to the ID behind CTAP, let's say. But what it does show is that despite that 2,000 signatories signed it, and no major pharmaceutical company did, what it shows is the limitation of the voluntary practice. Because you ask companies voluntarily, hey, don't you want to share your IP, your data, your knowledge with others so they can produce? Well, if that company does not want to do that, you have nothing else. There's nothing to do about it. So that's the limitation both of CTAP and of the EU COVID-19 manifesto, I would say. And then it comes to the waiver that was proposed, the TRIPS waiver. The European Union is quite strong in its opposition to the waiver. Trade, to understand as well, trade is an exclusive competency of the European Commission. So the European Commission leads in the negotiations. They have the expertise and the experts in the house to develop policies on trade and intellectual property rights, but it does consult with the member states. Like, it cannot go against the position of its own member states. So it will consult, and it does consult with different EU member states when it's defining its position. So it will draft a position, for example, then speak with the member states, and then use that position that was confirmed with the member states in the negotiations. The main reasons for oppositions for the EU are they consider that there's no proof of intellectual property rights barriers to accept such a waiver, which basically comes down to that they're not convinced by the evidence that is provided by the proponents of the proposal, and also when we talk to them, they say the same thing. Like, when we provide evidence, they also say we're not convinced. Although there are clear examples of ventilator valves, face masks, certain diagnostics, vaccines in the pipeline where we could identify IP barriers, they kind of say that it's not sufficient evidence to be adapting a waiver. They point to the existence of public health flexibilities in the TRIPS agreement, such as compulsory licensing, so that no waiver is needed in that regard. And overall, they kind of fear an erosion of an overhaul of the intellectual property rights system. I mean, they don't say that, they do say it as such, but more in bilateral. They haven't said that so much in the TRIPS agreement, but when we talk to them, that's something that comes out, that they are concerned about the intellectual property rights system, that the waiver goes too far in their opinion. What is really boiling down to within their position is that for decades already, the EU and the European Commission have been aggressive in promoting a system of intellectual property rights that protects the interest of EU companies. They don't want to backtrack from kind of the success, from their point of view, success in achieving those results. And they're really concerned about having more possibilities to question the intellectual property rights system or to sideline it at a time of crisis. So it's still the default position, despite the fact that it is a global pandemic that is affecting also the EU pretty hard. They're still taking their default position to try to protect the interests of those companies. That's a bit the underlying element there. So the conclusion when it comes to the EU, there's clearly a differentiation that we can make between the official narrative that was particularly used in the beginning of the pandemic and the facts. Yes, they pledged quite a bit of money, but they have missed the opportunity to use, to align some of the policies to use the money that was being pledged to the maximum advantage and make sure that there was, sufficient supply, maximum production, that money invested in research and development was also led to research and development results that could be used by others, both to produce or to continue the research. As I noted, or maybe I just want to emphasize this a bit more clearly, the EU has reserved 2.3 billion doses of vaccines for a population of 450 million people. While, for example, in COVAX, as was presented, it was in the previous presentation, there's about 400 million doses so far, and the poorest population that relies on COVAX is already 3 billion people. So there's a clear discrepancy in allocation of some of these resources. There was a plan at the WHO to do allocation according to needs, starting with healthcare workers, then the most vulnerable populations, people of a certain age, etc., and then the rest of the global population. By buying and reserving so many doses for itself, the EU has basically undermined, together with others, it's not only the EU, also the US, the UK, and others, basically undermined that allocation system. Although the EU keeps saying that its own vaccination strategy is complementary with a global response, the reality is that it protects the exclusive rights of pharmaceutical companies or rights holders, and then buys only from them and protects their interests. But as a result, that there's not many options over for everybody else who's losing out, so to say. Plus, its own investments that it has used has mainly benefited, the larger pharmaceutical players and some of the EU businesses, and they haven't invested in any manufacturing supply capacity in lower and middle income countries that would potentially help in overcoming some of the bottleneck. And then finally, as I noted, they're not open to lift intellectual property rights or other legal barriers to upscale global production beyond the current flexibilities in the TRIPS agreement. Maybe because I saw that was in some of the questions that was posed to us already before this call, maybe just to clarify a little bit more about the waiver and compulsory licensing. So compulsory licensing relates to the patent, because or maybe to take a step back, when there is a new treatment, vaccine, or diagnostic that a company or a researcher will want to bring to the market, sorry, my phrase is not finished there, what they will do is they will file one or many patents with the patent office saying, this is a new invention that I have, I want to protect it, I want to have the ownership rights, it's not ownership, but ownership rights or exclusive rights on this product, but I'm the one who's in charge of what happens to these products now. And then they will go to a regulatory agency for market approval. In Europe, this is the European Medicines Agency. You submit your data, your invention to the European Medicines Agency, and you say, look, I have this new vaccine, it's working really well, it's safe, it helps, to protect people from contracting COVID-19, they're less ill, etc. So, I would like to have approval for the market. And so these are two separate processes by two different agencies. One is the patent office, one is the medicines agency or the regulatory approval agency. Compulsory license only deals with the patent, only with the patent office. There they will say, look, we don't accept your patent anymore, or we will overrule this patent after a compulsory license, and we will allow another competitor to enter the market. The waiver actually addresses more than a patent. It's all the patents related to the product or to the product in this case. It also relates to the data that is being submitted for market approval. Because what happens, for example, by the European Medicines Agency, if you now submit it for a new treatment and you say, I want to sell this in Europe, they will ask you for data. And then you have for 8 years, at least 8 years, sometimes even longer, you will have exclusivity over those data. That means that if a generic company comes and they say, hey, I have exactly the same product as Dimitri has, and I want to sell this on the market as well, it's not patented, can I sell it as well? They will say, well, when was the data submitted, or do you have data? Well, no, I have no data, I'm a generic competitor, I don't do the trials myself. Can I use, or can we not use the same data that was submitted by Dimitri because it's the same product? They will say for 8 years, no, you can't. You cannot use the same data. So either a generic company does a clinical trial on patients, again, to prove that its product is safe and effective, which would be unethical, of course, to do that, and also a waste of money, or they will have to wait 8 years. And so this is something that compulsory licensing does not cover. The market approval kind of delays under regulatory data exclusivity or confidentiality. So addresses both the patents as well as the market approval barriers. It covers trade secrets, which is basically information that the company has and keeps secret on how to produce, for example, a certain vaccine or a product, specific information on that legally they can go to court and say, we want to protect this information, we don't want to share it with anybody else. If they hadn't shared it with anybody outside the company, they can actually go to court and also make sure that they can get compensated if it would ever be shared. industrial designs and copyrights for COVID-19 products. So the scope of the waiver is more broad. It covers many more potential barriers than what compulsory licensing alone would do. Also, with compulsory licensing, it relates to one product at a time. So for one product, you do a compulsory license, you have another diagnostic you want, you need to do a compulsory licenses, etc. With the waiver, it's clear. It's for all COVID-19 products, so you don't need to do a compulsory licensing one after the other. And maybe one more point, I haven't described it at this slide, is that with compulsory licensing, while, as we've seen in the presentation, it is possible to export products under compulsory licensing, it's quite limited. Like on all, particularly on the element of raw materials and ingredients, etc. It doesn't, because some companies or some countries have the possibility to produce active ingredients or raw materials, let's say the ingredients for medicine, and other countries have the possibility to manufacture the final products, to bring the ingredients together and then make one medicine or vaccine of them. But few countries have all the capacity to actually do that. And this is where the compulsory licensing is quite limited, because you're only supposed to serve your own population. So you would have faced difficulties to import the ingredients that you need, and you would face difficulties to export the final product that you would need. And this again is where the waiver would be clear. It will be the same for everybody, or at least for all the countries that apply the waiver and implement the waiver, that they can collaborate. They can, import products, export products, whatever they want. They can collaborate, develop them together. There's no limitation anymore, which would be very suitable for a time like this in a global pandemic. So that would be it in my presentation from my side.
Thank you so much, Dimitri. All right. That was a very, very informative overview of the position of the European institutions, of course. And I think it also inspires the organizations present in their advocacy efforts, let's say in the coming months on the issue of access to COVID-19 vaccines, of course. I will now move to our participants, because now we have time for discussion. 20 minutes we have left. I propose, so we already got a number of questions in the Q&A tab. Other people who do have questions, you can either post them there or you can raise your hand, so we can upgrade you to panelists. That way you can ask your question to the panelists out loud. Or if you want to share a comment, for example, you are very welcome to. I think that I noticed that some of the questions have already been answered, but I'm not sure if everybody of the participants is following in the Q&A tab. So let me just repeat one question. Prasanna, you already answered it, but maybe it's nice to come back to it so all the participants are aware. So Lee Haynes asked the question: what is the current status of the TRIPS waiver proposal? What can civil society do at the global, national, and local level to push for this? And she also asks if there is any organizing already underway with the People's Health Movement or other coalitions. And she also asks quite a number of questions. Who are the targets of that advocacy work? Prasanna,
You want me to answer live?
Yeah, if possible, yeah.
Yeah, no, the TRIPS waiver was a hot property in December, but later it was pushed to March, also to maybe allow for the pharmaceutical companies to get these bilateral deals done with the countries, and then the scramble for vaccine doses happens and those sorts of things. So it has been pushed to March, any decision taking. There have been discussions, there have been questions asked by the member countries, there have been clarifications sought, but only 9 countries, Priyam, I'm correct, no? Only 9 countries have been opposing this, including EU. So that is where it stands. Of course, PHM and other coalitions continue to work on getting the waiver done for 2 reasons. One is that the poorer countries are not going to get the vaccine tomorrow. They will have to wait their turn in some sense. So in that sense, if a waiver happens, then they can import the cheaper generic versions with competition and those sorts of things. And another is that the waiver will create a precedence for future pandemics. So most of these international laws work on precedents. So once you have a waiver for COVID-19, and pandemics are not going to be going away anywhere. So that is so that will create a precedence, and with that intention, we are still working. I mean, all the coalitions, MSF, Oxfam, every one of us is working on getting the waiver uh, in some sense. And actually, the ECI initiative should keep talking about the waiver also. It is very important. So that because EC has, I mean, EU along with the US have been the major blocking ones in some sense. So, and
Yeah, if
that's
I
why
can
we have
maybe.
the, sorry, and that's why we have the nuanced position that if EU or US do not want to use the waiver, it is fine, but let it allow for the waiver to happen. So that is a nuanced position on the instrument. Sorry, Dimitri.
No, no
You
worries,
want to tell something?
Prasanna. I think it's an important nuance indeed that we're applying as well. I mean, it's one thing to not apply the waiver to yourself and apply, let's use the word reply rather than respect, apply intellectual property rights in your own territory, but do you also, you know, prevent your neighbor who doesn't have access to the products from saying, well, sorry for you, but you can't access them and you can't produce them. That's something else. So this is where we also say allow it at the global level, and then countries can choose for themselves. In terms of advocacy targets, I would say our own governments in our own countries, and then asking them to put pressure at the EU level, because the Commission is um, susceptible to pressure. We do notice that they already evolved in their position to some extent. They have become a bit softer already. They were pretty hardline in the beginning in saying no. Now it's a bit more, we understand there are issues, but we don't agree with the conclusions of those agreements. I mean, it's softening a bit. We're not there yet, but there's a bit more opening, which is partly due to pressure from Parliament, from civil society, and including some member states who have also apparently told the Commission to be a bit more open-minded in their position. Maybe one nuance that I want to add, though, because we have talked a lot about vaccines, but the waiver does not only apply to vaccines. And even when it comes to the effect of the waiver on vaccines, there are other technical issues, etc., that we need to take into account. It's not because the waiver will be available tomorrow that tomorrow we will have vaccines everywhere. It will take a bit of time to evolve, obviously, and there will be other problems that need to be solved. But the waiver also applies for diagnostics, where there are also issues, and with therapeutics. And actually, we need to bear in mind that it's easier if there would be therapeutic, and there are a couple of interesting products that are being developed, but they're not finalized yet. We don't know if they really work and are safe. But if they would be, it's far easier to produce often certain medicines and bring them available to those who are really ill, rather than to vaccinate a whole population in a country. It's logistically a far more difficult exercise. So that's also where, you know, we need to see the waiver also to be applicable in many more products than the vaccines alone. So I just want to add that as a nuance in the discussion.
Thank you both. I think that one point that it's actually one of the questions that has been answered in the Q&A chat box as well, but that follows up on this discussion. It's Inyas Rons who asks, will trying to change IPR not risk to delay the efforts to have the vaccine largely distributed quickly? Because some countries, they could fight those efforts fearing attacks on the IPR system. And he says, I don't think the fight against IPR will be easy and quick, and immunization cannot wait for that. So it's the argument basically saying that if we focus our efforts on the IPR system, then we are losing time. How do you judge this argument?
I'm happy to take this one. I think it's not one or the other. I mean, we need all different approaches. Yes, I mean, this is also why we are not opposed to COVAX, and we are happy with the pledging that went from the EU to COVAX, etc. But there are different elements and complexities to a major challenge that was imposed by us, by nature, so to say. Nobody wanted this pandemic, let's be clear. And there's not going to be one solution, and so there is definitely an element of intellectual property rights, you know, limitations supply, because that's what we're talking about. By providing monopoly to one company alone, it's only the supply that is provided by this one company, or whatever they grant to another company to say you can also produce a bit if you want in this particular context, but taking away that barrier so that there can be more supply. So it is definitely an option. Of course, we hope that the consultations or the discussions at the TRIPS Council do not continue forever and that we would lose valuable time too much. So I do see your point of concern. It's a valid concern, but we cannot drop on this one. Like, it's too important to let go. We need to look at all the options.
Thank you, Dimitri. One more question that I found in the Q&A section. So there's this question on Oxford's partnership with AstraZeneca, where they have committed to providing the vaccine on a not-for-profit basis for the duration of the pandemic across the world. And if I am not mistaken, there has also been this deal with the Serum Institute in India between AstraZeneca and the Serum Institute to exchange technologies basically and start producing in India the vaccines as well. Now, the question that Sarah asks is, she asks if this will be enough, if this will do basically to supply vaccines to low and middle income countries.
I'll take that. Actually, the fact that a public university, Oxford University, discovered vaccine was handed over to private pharmaceutical companies speaks a lot about where that is going. So, and there is also a huge allegation that Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation had a big hand in it, of handing over a public vaccine to a private company. And the private company then enters into an agreement with another private company in India, that is Serum Institute. So if the knowledge is in the private hands, and if a public knowledge has been handed over to a private hand, you cannot have much of a knowledge transfer happening. So that is one aspect. The second aspect is one Serum Institute cannot manufacture 8 million, even assuming 2 million doses or 2 billion doses, it cannot do that. It cannot be faster. So as Dimitri made the statement, what was the statement, Dimitri? The EU statement? I forget now.
Nobody's safe until everybody's safe.
Precisely. So for everybody to be safe, one Serum Institute cannot manufacture for the whole world. Of course, the Pfizers and Modernas have had bilateral deals and all those things. But even taking just the developing nations in place, I don't think Serum Institute would be enough. And that is where knowledge transfer, not holding back on knowledge and innovations, and who knows, a better product might emerge if the knowledge is kept into the open pool. So that is the short answer.
Maybe just to add on here that from the beginning of the pandemic, and I think it was beginning of April, so it was beginning of the pandemic in Europe, let's be clear, because it started a bit earlier, of course, in China, but when the pandemic hit Europe and other regions, we wrote quite quickly to the European Commission asking them, invest a lot of money in the development of vaccines and products, but do with global open licensing, which basically means pay a lot to researchers and companies. You can develop the product, we will buy them from you, we will guarantee you will return your investment, etc., and we will pay you for those products, but also enable that elsewhere other producers can do it as well. They completely disregarded our request several times in a row. Then we started to say, okay, these products are in the pipeline, do tech transfer, because maybe your product will be developed, the vaccine that is most effective is maybe developed in the US, or maybe the one in China. We don't know yet. So maybe make an agreement at global level that whatever comes out and what is effective, you can share with each other, that everybody can swap. We all do investments, we all take risks, but the one who finds it will share it with everybody else. They completely disregarded it, unfortunately. And this has been a pattern all along that they weren't open to these kind of views. And this is a bit the reality that we face right now, that as I said, the supplies are being bought to a larger extent, at least for the vaccines, to the detriment of elsewhere, and there hasn't been any sharing. But it isn't over yet, and I think the waiver is definitely in that regard an important step, particularly because it comes from the global south. It has support of about 100 countries worldwide. That's very large number. It's rare that this happens, particularly at the WTO. So let's see where this leads us. I'm quite hopeful that at least there will be a possibility for change, considering where we stand already.
Yeah, South Africa is also contemplating putting it to vote. So it might also go for voting. So that is another. WTO generally works on consensus, but South Africa is exploring seriously the voting, whether it can push the votes. Yeah, so push for voting. Yeah.
Okay, I have two more questions. One I will probably just read both of them out loud, and then you can answer if you feel like. So, well, one is in French, so I'll have to translate. Can we be sure that the quality of the vaccines that will be administered in poor countries will be the same as in European countries, other countries around the world? And then I guess that this, well, has a lot to do also with transparency that we are not seeing enough. And then a final question: what about the efforts for fair pricing launched by the WHO? Um,
Yeah, one quick and short answer for the fair pricing launched by WHO. Where is WHO? That's the answer for that. So WHO is nowhere. It has been relegated to the margins. It has been consciously done so that the Bill and Melinda Gates foundations can come up, and so there is no globally global health governance as yet. So there is no one governing institution which is deciding or regulating and those sorts of things. So it is left to those larger philanthropic organizations, if at all. So they have become larger than life. So WHO, as it stands today, stands no chance anywhere in pushing any of its values. So one of the action points for us, even beyond COVID, is to strengthen the likes of WHO as against the WTOs and the World Banks. So that is one. So as regarding the quality of the vaccines, it is that the quality has never been an issue. Most of the Indian companies are also having what is called as GMP standards, global manufacturing practices standards. So in that sense, quality should not be a concern. And also because India has become the pharmacy of the world because of its quality generic medicine. So in that sense, the apprehensions need not be there about the quality being served in Europe as against, because the technology more or less, supposing Oxford has developed the technology, it is getting what you call manufactured, so to say, in India, and hence that apprehension should not be there. There are issues with regulatory mechanisms, but that doesn't talk to the quality as such of manufacturing.
Yeah, maybe if I can add to it, there is a process called the WHO pre-qualification process, which basically is if a company would produce, for example, a medicine or a vaccine, and the WHO would regard it and say, yes, this is safe, this is of the quality that we need. Many of the countries, also in the developing world, would rely on that approval to say, okay, it has been pre-approved by the WHO, we will apply that in our own country as well. So as long as the product has been pre-approved by the WHO, it should be reliable in terms of quality. Of course, I cannot speak for any kind of product that somebody makes without any approval, and that is on a black market, etc. But that's an exception. That's not what we can talk about here, because that's something that nobody can control. But generally, the products that come from a reliable manufacturer that were WHO pre-qualified and enter the market through the regular process, they should be safe and effective. That's how it should be. And I'm saying that particularly with regards, because there has to be a process followed where the data is submitted. And that's, for example, with the Russian manufacturers, etc., also the case. Like, it's important to have transparent data that is submitted in the right processes and follow the right steps. And this is where WHO plays an important role.
Just to add to that, the question of whether the developing countries will get good quality vaccines or therapeutics is actually an old trick in the bag, because it's not like they don't have the capacity to make quality and safe products. This is a way of diverting your attention from the main issue of requiring greater access and pooling of knowledge and technology, and that's what we should be looking at. Because quality, like Dimitri and Prasanna have pointed out, there are different regulatory bodies that look at it, and there are entities that are capable of manufacturing safe products. That's what I say.
Thank you, everyone. Maybe to end, I have a question, because we are here all together with a number of civil society organizations doing a lot of advocacy work, mobilizing the population basically for equitable access. So I would like to hear from all of you, like very shortly, because we now have this huge opportunity with the pandemic to actually change things. If you could end on a positive note and basically send the participants home with some hope, some inspiration, some enthusiasm, if you could do that, of course.
Shall I go first?
Go ahead.
Okay, I want to just give an example of what happened in 2005, 2006, when India changed its patent laws to conform to World Trade Organization, TRIPS compliance and all. India was wanting to do more than what the TRIPS asked for. And then that is when we evolved a global campaign. It was called Global Campaign Against Indian Patent Amendment, wherein 80 countries participated globally, put pressure on Indian government from everywhere, from WHO to UNAIDS to everyone wrote up. And that's when for the first time I heard some countries' names like Burkina Faso or Togo or something like that. So pressure came in from all the sides for India to then change its pro-industry, pro-corporate law to a pro-people, I mean to somewhat pro-people law. So there is hope, but only thing is we will have to really work in a global solidarity manner and then take the fight to each country, to each union, to each of these, and then keep this public debate going for us to. So ultimately we have to move towards divorcing or splitting up the financial incentive and the research and development. Once that happens, then only there is hope of equitable access globally. Sorry.
Yeah, maybe just to say from my side, my organization has worked for the past 20 years on access to medicines, vaccines, and diagnostics around the world. It hasn't always been easy, but we made quite a number of successes in bringing down HIV prices, and particularly to bring availability for HIV. I mean, not only us, it was also with partners like People's Health Movement, etc. over the years. With, at the moment there are hundreds of thousands of people who have access, or millions of people who have access to HIV medications at an affordable price, etc. So it is possible to make changes and bring results in this area, definitely. And it takes sustained effort, but I think this pandemic is forcing all of us to think about the challenges that are ahead of us at the global level, not on the individual level, and we just have to force policymakers or confront them with their own responsibility. And I think that now is a time more than ever to do that. So I'm quite hopeful in terms of the prospects of being able to make changes in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, if I can add with another encouraging example, another type of European Citizens Initiative a few years ago was the big campaign against the TTIP trade agreement between the European Union and the United States. It was also a petition that eventually was signed by, I guess, 3 million European citizens. And it was a trade agreement, so it was about everything. It was about food control, energy, basically any type of things that we trade, but it was also very much about pharmaceutical products and the influence of big pharmaceutical companies that would be expanded. And the public outrage and mobilization was so big that eventually the agreement never came about. So there's definitely a victory possible at the European level with the tool of European Citizens Initiative. We'll just have to make sure that we stay mobilized and that we gain all the public support that we can get.
Yeah, so the South African example is another example which has been a victory in some sense of access to generic medicines, of HIV medicines, when the whole globe rallied around South Africa's move and then shamed the pharma companies, and that's how the victory was got. So I think South African example is another one.
And what's very heartening is that health has taken the center stage. We are reading about health on the front pages like never before. People want to know what a virus is, how does it spread, and I think it's an opportune time for all of us to get together and ask for what is essential to our very existence, which is health and keeping us in right conditions. And that is probably can also something that topple governments, if nothing else, which is if we don't exist, you don't exist. And that's something that we can all rally on together. And it's very heartening how everybody's coming together and working towards getting more access, breaking those boundaries, and going against nationalism in vaccines or therapeutics.
Thank you. Thanks all of you for these inspiring
Yeah, 31,000 signatures.
examples.
31,000 signatures in 1.5 months.
Exactly. And counting, of course.
And counting.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Prasanna. Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you, Priyam. Thank you, Julie, for being here. Thank you to all the participants for joining. I hope you were able to learn stuff that you didn't know, to inspire, to help yourselves. Let's go and let's make this happen. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Very
Many
inspiring.
thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
A good day. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.